So welcome tonight. In acknowledgement of country, we would want to acknowledge the Warring Ilum Bullock clan of the Dommarong people of the Kulin Nation, their elders past and present, living on land that was never ceded. Now, 2030 Yay started in 2020 to develop some local responses to the growing climate challenge with a goal to get to zero net emissions by 2030. And you can see our work at 2030.com.au. Tonight, we have a presentation called Ethical Retirement Investments. And in this presentation, you'll hear how to choose ethical investments and the effort to get started. The work done by market forces to call out greenwashing by major corporations. And these things will help you to ask your superannuation fund how they invest your money and get involved in direct action and get started on wise investing while considering the planet. And well, so why should we do this presentation? Well, it seems like calling our group 2030 Yay might be just a bit in vain, because the world has effectively reached 1.5 Celsius in warming, and the rate of global warming, of climate warming, is accelerating. Energy-related CO2 emissions reached a new record high in 2024, and fossil fuel extraction is set to quadruple by the end of the decade. Our federal government's response to Woodside for continued gas extraction show how complacent we are. Warming of 3 degrees or more could lead to catastrophic consequences, including food production, decline, water scarcity, forced migration, and the collapse of organised global communities. At 4 degrees Celsius, adaptation no longer be possible. Anyway, we're going to do our bit. Tonight we have 2 speakers, John Agostinelli, who's a chartered accountant and founding partner of Agostinelli Perlin, established in 1987, and John has in excess of 40 years' experience in the industry. So welcome, John. He's also moved to Murrindindi community, which is part of Murrindindi Shire, in September 2022, and we're glad he's around. We're also very glad to welcome Munira Chowdhury, who's the acting Australian campaigns manager at Market Forces with expertise in energy finance in the Asia-Pacific region. She's passionate about climate justice. And the company she works for, Market Forces, runs campaigns to show up companies that invest in activities which are bad for the climate and ultimately for the planet. So welcome, Munira. So each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, after which we'll have Q&A. So thanks to Adam Dennis for organising tech and recording, to Claire Daly for advertising and communications, and Claire sends their apologies, she has COVID, to the Murrindindi Shire Council for funding this event, and to Deb Redding for catering. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Elaine. Thanks for the opportunity. So my disclaimer, I'm a mere accountant, so I'm not a financial advisor. When Elaine asked me to speak, I immediately said, I don't have the faintest idea about any of this, but what a great opportunity to learn. And so I've been reading a lot and I've learned a lot. So here we go. And my other thing, somebody said to me recently, don't be afraid. If you know more than your audience, you'll do well. So I said, well, I'm not going to do well because I think my audience knows more than I do. So we'll see. My discussion is about how do we make informed decisions on investment and what are we actually wanting. So there's no recommendations on which investment or which fund. It will be just how do we actually make a decision. So does investing, or more particularly picking a superannuation fund or investment house, ensure adequate or even good returns and being sustainable, or sustaining our planet? Is that possible? So may I start with identifying some jargon and meanings. So ethical investing, which we've often heard about, does this incorporate keeping climate change targets at the top of mind? What is sustainable? The acronym often seen is ESG. I suspect everyone's probably familiar with ESG. I actually wasn't a few months ago, but that stands for environmental, social and governance. So not only climate, but climate typically is part of this. Usually under ESG is not what is included, but what is excluded. So typically people who want ethical investments say we don't want to invest in tobacco, weapons of war, gambling, child or oppressive labour. So they're the things that you don't want. So it's not often what is included, it's what is excluded. The vast majority of investors want ESG, it's been reported, and to be sustainable, but also want a return that allows them a reward for risk to fund their needs. How much return are you willing to sacrifice for a better planet? That's the question. Do you have to accept lower returns? Providers generally say they strive to drive long-term investment value and returns while seeking sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment and society. How do we determine if they are doing that, and how is it measured? Well, there's help. There are a number of organisations set up to monitor platforms for their ESG and sustainability. For example, a group called Sustainable Platform. I'm sure Munira might mention those later on. There's a sustainable classification standard and a UN Sustainable Development Goal. So basically, companies are given a sustainable score, and that helps to identify those investments that if you're investing directly in the companies. So if you've got a self-managed fund, that might help. There are various bodies established to promote ESG, such as the RIAA, Responsible Investment Association Australasia. Elaine has referred me to a really good report that I found very useful by the RIAA titled Responsible Investment Super Study 2023. They don't do it every year, so I couldn't find a 2024, so I think the one before that was 21. So that's worth a read. What else is happening in terms of reporting? So legislation such as Your Future, Your Super. This is about increased disclosure and reporting, but only gaining ground in the last 2 to 3 years. But that is good news. There's a lot of extra reporting because of Your Future, Your Super. Secondly, reporting. There's a trend for companies to adopt accounting standards for sustainable practices. These are globally required standards and practices, and my profession, the accounting profession, is fast moving to make sure that they know what the standards are and how to implement them and apply them to financial reports. Under the heading I've got funds and investing, there's only a small number of funds that target sustainable themed investments. And what are the drivers for any fund? So I suggest there's an expectation of better long-term performance. B, demand from investors for responsible investment. We're going to hear a lot about that. So it's the investors that drive where the investments are going to be made. So if investors wanted more sustainable and more ethical investments, then the fund managers are going to have to do that. And thirdly, there's the regulatory requirements. Research and reports generally confirm that responsible super funds performed on average as well, if not better than the ones deemed not so responsible. So what's the driver? I think the driver is that the funds don't do what they need to do, they'll disappear due to the pressure from their members. I'm hoping that we're going to have lots of questions because that's where I'm going to leave it.
There you go. Well, thanks, John. And we might hand over to Munira, speaking to us from Melbourne. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We've done acknowledgement of country before we started, but one thing I want to mention is that for any climate action, there's no climate justice or environmental justice without First Nations justice. So that's something we recognize and deeply feel as a part of our organization at Market Forces. So what is market forces? We have a vision that the world will exist in a way that where money is used to protect nature and climate and not harm it. And our mission is to protect the environment by driving finance away from the causes of global warming. So we've captured a bit about climate change and what's happening in this world right now, but there's a lot of things the people in this room and our communities can do in order to help this situation. And a lot of it is through our existing bank accounts, our existing investments. We've heard some really interesting things about ethical investment, which is something we should all look into in this day and age with the changing world. So thank you so much for the presentation. So yeah, what I'll before I get into the nitty-gritties, again, similar to the previous presenter, disclaimer, this is not financial advice. A lot of our work is research and providing the information to the public. Obviously, you'll be making decisions based on your personal circumstances and what's easy for you to do. So our work essentially follows the money. So think of a coal mine, for example. What we do is look at which bank has provided funding for this mine or potentially will provide funding for this coal mine. We look at the investors behind the project. So there could be big investors like Vanguard, or if for Australian context, the super funds play a really big role as well as large investors. And then besides that, we also look at various factors that play into a project going ahead. So which company is behind it and what kind of money is being put into these projects. And with all of this work, we work with everyday people in Australia and overseas to make sure that these banks, these investors, and these companies are being held accountable. So getting into more details, we will talk about the big four Australian banks. Can I get a show of hands for people who are with one of the big four banks? Myself. I mean, myself included. So you'd be shocked or not very shocked to hear that in the last few years, the big four banks, NZ, NAB, Westpac, and CommBank, have provided $61 billion to fossil fuels. And it is a shocking number because all these banks have made their commitments to climate action. They have been very public about commitment to net zero by 2050. They've been very public about taking the Paris Agreement really seriously. And we've seen shift over time, like definitely we've seen a decline in their fossil fuel investments. But our analysis into their policies shows that there's still lots of work to do. Amongst the big four, NAB, Westpac, and NZ are still relatively involved in oil and gas projects that are harmful for the environment and our future. And the science is clear, right? If we are to keep things at 1.5 degrees or even a safe less than 2 degrees, there can be no new projects. And that's our ask. We're not saying shut down everything tomorrow. What we're saying is that for future, don't dig up new coal, don't dig up new oil and gas. Let's keep it in the ground. So yeah, CommBank is a really incredible success story. Our organization has existed for 10-ish years, and we've engaged with lots of community members, bank customers to kind of put these banks on notice and tell them, hey, I don't want my money to be invested in fossil fuels. And incredibly, last year, CommBank has shown really good progress where there was a deal that they were involved with Santos, which is one of Australia's biggest oil and gas company. And last year we saw that they removed themselves from that refinance deal. So yeah, it was really interesting to see that shift. And over time, we're also seeing Combank decline their involvement in fossil fuel projects. So it's a real success story. And the success, really, the credit goes to people holding Combank to account. And that's what we do in our work. And that's what we hope you'd be able to take back to your communities, because that's the truth. Most of us are with one of the big four banks.
Can I ask a question at this point?
Yeah.
I understand that, both speakers have said we'll put pressure on the banks, and I understand that these large shareholder companies can actually put pressure on the bank. In fact, they turn up to bank meetings and say, they thump their fist on the table and say, if you don't do this, and the banks obviously listen because they have a whole heap of shares. And as an individual, I find it hard to see myself making a difference. Now, am I in furious agreement with all the other individuals in the world who also think that, can I make a difference by changing banks? And if I change banks, I'd probably go to Bendigo, and I don't know whether Bendigo's any better anyway. As an individual, can we do something?
Definitely. Look, you're thinking of yourself, but if you go back to your family and friends, that's 10 people. And those 10 people will take it to 10 others each, and that's hundreds of people. Like, it's a domino effect. And while big investors hold a sway with banks, the big four banks in Australia really care about their customers. That's something they deeply care about. They care about their reputation. They care about what customers say. So when the process that we recommend is, the first thing to do is putting your bank on notice. And if you go to our website, it's a really simple process. You put your name there. I'll share the link after the call. And what it will do is you can send a message directly to your bank saying, hey, I'm unhappy with what's happening right now. You investing in fossil fuels. I want that to change. So that's a first step. And then you can kind of escalate and talk to your local bank manager and say, hey, I'm unhappy with this. I've sent an email, but I want more conversation about what's going on. And then the next step could be, if your circumstances allow, is to switch banks. I can give my personal example. I've switched all my savings into an ethical bank. That way, at least I know that where my money is being invested is in ethical things and not really fossil fuels or other harmful industries. So I'm just giving that example. So yeah, we start off with smaller things, and then I think the final straw can be if you see that they're not changing, if you see that it's not shifting for you, that's when you could switch over. And on our website, we also provide information about banks that are funding fossil fuels. So you can kind of see that list of banks and which banks are out of fossil fuels and, investing in more environment-friendly projects. So that's kind of the last straw. And even with the switching, we don't say just do that. We say do that and talk about it publicly. Talk about it with your friends and family. Talk about it within your community. And if you keep adding that, that's millions of dollars. Just keep adding, and it just rolls and snowballs into a huge impact.
Right, because I have transitioned most of my savings into not one of those four banks, but I'm now worried that I don't know the bank I've transitioned it to is any better. So your website has that listing?
Yes, there's a compare banks table where there's the information about all the banks that operate, the big ones at least, that operate in Australia.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Any other questions on banks?
I might make a comment, if I may.
Yeah.
The other thing I find is that the banks have got shareholders and they're responsible to their shareholders. So that if the shareholders put pressure, and the majority or the major shareholders are the super funds. So if you as a member put pressure on your super fund, which puts pressure on the bank, then that's probably the most useful change.
So I've got a question too. So if you think about actual numbers of people, how many people do you need to make a change?
I can answer that in the shareholder framing, as
Okay,
we're talking about shareholders, because I was coming to that. So in Australia, the rule is if 100 shareholders put forward a resolution to the board, the entire company has to vote on it. So even if you have the smallest share parcel, you own a share in, say, for example, Commonwealth Bank, just as an example. 100 shareholders, and that's not too many people, can put forward a resolution that the entire company, so if it's a billion-dollar company, all the shareholders with billions of shares, even the big ones, even the super funds, they all have to vote on this resolution. And that's work we have done with shareholders, and that's work we do with shareholders. So what we do is bring together 100 shareholders who care about climate, who care about the environment, and what they would ask companies like the big four banks, for example, or any fossil fuel company, is that we want you to have a business strategy that's aligned with a safe future. So asking the company for accountability, really. And then when it comes to the banks, for instance, it could be, we want you to have better policies where you're not backing fossil fuels anymore.
So
And
it's irrespective of the shareholding, you just need 100 shareholders.
Yes, that's what we have in Australia. It varies across countries, but in Australia, it's 100 shareholders. And we also have a web page for shareholders. And if you have shares and would like to get involved, you totally could. And sign on to this. So we prepare the paperwork. All you'd have to do is review and sign on to that resolution. Yeah, and we've seen some really incredible change from companies. In the past, we've seen companies drop out from coal mines. We've seen companies drop out from gas power stations. So we've seen really like tangible, real change doing the shareholder work. And that's the thing, you may feel like you've got a small share parcel, but that's making a huge impact. Yeah, and super funds as well, like any of us working in Australia would have a super fund, and the super fund industry is huge. $4 trillion is invested by super funds, and most of the Australian companies listed at the stock exchange will have ownership by super funds, and that's through our savings in these funds, right? So we have our savings with these super funds, and then what these super funds do is go and invest money. And that's another part of our work. We're trying to get super funds to make decisions that are good for the environment and not necessarily invest in fossil fuels. And one incredible example that we've seen recently is with UniSuper, which is the super fund that university professionals have. They've been campaigning with us for a really long time for UniSuper to shift away from fossil fuels. And last year, was it last year or earlier this year, the company dropped shares in APA, which is a gas pipeline company, in the billions. So that was work that university professionals, professors, people that work at universities have been doing. And thousands of members from this super fund have put their super fund on notice, continually saying that we want you to shift away from fossil fuels. The super fund itself, when it divested from this, and divestment is like dropping money out of the company. I don't want to get too jargony. When the super fund did it, they did not give credit to members for the pressure they've been putting for a long time. They did not say that was the reason they did it, but that's what's happened ahead of this decision being made by the super fund. So that's really interesting and incredible work we've seen happen. And HESTA as well, there's ongoing work on HESTA that members of HESTA are really active on. And yeah, we think super funds is another way in which you could put pressure on fossil fuel companies and get them to shift. The other thing I wanted to talk about is fossil fuel companies. The big ones that we actively engage with and are trying them to stop expansionary projects specifically, like new projects to go ahead. Santos, Woodside, names you may be familiar with. APA, which is a pipeline company. It's a major gas pipeline company in Australia. JERA, which is a Japanese company. You may not have ever heard of them, but they're a mess. They're one of the world's biggest LNG companies. And they're the ones buying gas from Australia. So they play a really big role. Whitehaven Coal. There's so many to name, but if you hold shares with these companies, don't feel bad yet, because you could be using your shares and your shareholder power to hold these companies accountable. And another thing you can do is attend annual general meetings and ask questions, holding the board of directors accountable. And we've seen that as well over time. Like now, fossil fuel company AGMs can get really heated because there's so much pressure from the community, from different range of shareholders, from affected community members. So there's a lot of things happening at these annual general meetings, and that's kind of the only opportunity for everyday people to face talk to the board. So that's another opportunity that I wanted to talk to this group about.
It's kind of a tricky thing to do to work out which companies have their fingers in which part of the fossil fuel industry. I've been running my personal super fund for many years, and I haven't been particularly looking at this type of stuff, but looking at tobacco, alcohol, gambling, and even the most innocuous companies like Beef and Cheese run a little sideline tobacco if you actually read through their company report, right? So, and I suspect there's a lot of companies out there that also do the same with fossil fuels and and pipelines and things. Does your website cover that at all?
Yeah, we have that information, at least for the biggest super funds. So I believe the top 30 at least, in terms of asset, how big they are in terms of asset under management. So we have that information on our website, and you can just select your super fund and see how much they're invested in fossil fuels. And also recently, the law in Australia has changed, and super funds they mandatory disclose which companies they're invested in. So every 6 months, they put out a list of all the companies they're involved in. And what we do is take that from each and every super fund, analyze it, and put it all together on our website. So you should get the summary on our website, but there should also be individual super fund information on their websites as well, because that's mandatory now.
Yeah. Okay.
So one of the things I found very useful when thinking about this topic was to look at Future Super, a super organisation. And they have a very detailed PDF of all of the companies that they invest in. And there are a few hundred. And I thought, well, because they have a focus on ethical, renewable investment, that's a really good place to get an idea of where to start. Not that I've mentioned a specific company, but I have.
There's information on our website on the funds that are better than the others in terms of ethical investment, so you can have a look. And like I said, a lot of it depends on personal circumstances. I'm guilty of holding on to one of the big four banks. But yeah, moved all my savings to an ethical bank. So look, really, it's what you can do, and the small things matter. The small things make a difference.
My super fund is with a organisation, which is an umbrella, and underneath that they invest in a whole lot of different companies. How do we ensure, particularly on international companies, that are doing ethical investments they claim to be, but how do we actually make sure that they're being not sort of greenwashing us?
Well, you can just ask them. You can email them and say, hey, this is my super fund. I would like a list of all the companies. You can get in touch with them and just ask. You can ask for.
I have that
that.
list. I have the list of the companies that they're investing with. But how do I mean, I think there's something like 40 companies in that fund that I personally got investments in. How do I make sure that they are not greenwashing me? Because that to me is, I mean, one of the big super funds recently in Australia got caught out for greenwashing and lost a lot of credibility.
We've done an analysis on the Australian companies and a few on Japanese companies as well, but not on all international companies. We haven't done that, but other research organizations like RIAA may have done that work.
Okay.
It is a tough one, right? Because there's hundreds of companies invested, and like we don't know every little detail of these companies. That's a tricky one. But yeah, I think the starting conversation can be just asking your super fund for more accountability and more transparency, because like we just heard before I started speaking, the standards of accountability are much, much higher now. Like they have to report against ESG.
Right.
So there seems to be a big growth in ETFs. Do you think that gives another layer of the possibility for greenwashing? I
mean, that I think the same applies for any diversified portfolio, right? Like any diversified portfolio will have a lot of range of companies. The ones to watch out for, I think, that can be more dangerous than others is when it's overweight. So, for example, recently we saw Australian Super investing in Whitehaven Coal, which is a coal company in Australia. And if you look at the market share of Whitehaven in the Australian Stock Exchange, Australian Super has invested way more. Like it's very overweight is the technical word for it. Almost more than 8% of Whitehaven's shares are now owned by Australian Super, which we think is really dangerous because that's betting all these people's future savings into a coal company, which in a decarbonized world, in a safe climate world, coal companies are not supposed to exist at all. So I think those are the ones to really look out for. That's really dangerous. Yes, I mean, in ETFs or diversified portfolios, that will happen. Companies will slip in with fossil fuel projects. And that's why we're trying to do that research and share that information with the general public.
So Australian Super is the largest managed fund in Australia. What percentage of people have what percentage of people have their super with Australian Super?
I would have to look up that information, and I'm not it's not at the top of my mind. But yeah, it is the biggest. It's I think if you combine like 10 or 20 of the smallest ones, Australian Super is still bigger than all of those combined. So yeah, it's pretty massive.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the involvement with market forces?
Yeah, so that's what I would have closed on. So if you want to get involved, you can just look up our webpage. You can have a look on our banks page. There's so much information. Just if it's overwhelming, start small, start with one thing. the actions are really easy. So we have email prompts where you can put your name and put your email address, and then it will automatically send an email to the banks and they can get back to you in their own time. So there's lots of different prompts, and we have similar things for super funds as well. If you want to write an email to your super fund, you can do that. To keep in touch and see what's happening, you can follow our social media. Our social media team is incredible, and they make these beautiful graphics, and you can see the presentation. They did the work. So yeah, follow us on social media as well. Mostly you'll see all the incredible work we do with community, with other NGOs. And we will post about our wins when they happen. So you can keep in touch with that. That's kind of low effort. Just as you're browsing, you can see what's going on. And yeah, there's so many email actions on almost every web page. Like you can always take action on the fossil fuel companies as well. There's like automated email that we've written, and you can change it or modify it to your wish and send it to fossil fuel companies. And yeah, you can also volunteer with us. You can provide your shares. If you have shares with companies, you can provide proxies, where I have gone to annual general meetings on behalf of a shareholder to ask questions. So you can do that. We do that for traditional owners as well, that are impacted community members. We've done that for bushfire survivors, where they have gone to a bank or a fossil fuel company, and they're talking about the real world impact that we're seeing from extreme weather and extreme climate change as it's getting worse and worse. So yeah, we can do a range of different things. And if you have money to spare, I understand cost of living is difficult on all of us, and you can also donate and be a regular donor with us.
How many people work in your organization?
There's about 30 of us, and about 15 of us in Australia, and the rest we have overseas across the Asia Pacific. We have team members in Japan, team members in Indonesia, in Thailand. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So are there any other questions? Actually, I've got a question for John.
Go for it.
So it's a discussion that you and I had about a month ago, how when you've got a self-managed super fund and you've spent all this time doing the research and you've bought the shares, and then, oh, blow, you find out that really you shouldn't have this one. It's really, really hard to make the change on one or on all of them. But, you know, the behaviour change part that you talked about before, I think is...
I'm not sure. I don't think it depends what stage you are in your self-managed super fund. So assume, can I give you some tax advice?
Yes.
That I'm qualified for. So if you're in the retirement phase, pension phase,
that's me.
then it's much easier because there's no tax applicable in most cases.
Yeah.
So you could, in Australia, the superannuation industry is probably the most tax effective investment in the world. It's the biggest tax haven in the world, in fact, because you pay no tax. It's a legal tax haven. So you can buy and sell, and all you're up for is your $29.95 transaction cost.
$19.95 concept.
There you go. So I found I started looking after my father's super fund, and what he did, 40 years ago, he went to the stockbroker and they gave him 40 shares, and and he had Santos and Woodside and Tabcorp and British Tobacco, and you can't have, you can't do this. So thankfully, he also had Commonwealth Bank, and which is an interesting story in Munira. When I look at the share price for Commonwealth Bank, and it's gone up incredibly over the last few months, and maybe it's they're moving away from fossil fuel. So what I did progressively is got him out of all those ESG. Ones like And some were hard because it's never the right time to sell, and you go, no, that's all right, we'll just get out anyway. Get out of Tabcorp just as they're pushing out tax lotto or tax or whatever they were doing, like Lottery Foundation. So my answer is, I don't think it's that hard to get out of individual stocks. If you were not in retirement phase, it's a little bit harder because you'll take a hit from a tax point of view, but in most cases you can manage those things.
So there's a go for market forces. You can focus on retirement, people in retirement, because they're a big chunk of the superannuation.
Majority of our supporters are people in retirement. Like most of our volunteers are people that are retired because they just love to spend their time doing this work. And our shareholder base as well. It's mostly mom and dad shareholders.
Munira, what I find is that thankfully I find the retirees, that generation is very ethical, but I'm also really comforted by the younger people are more and more ethical, and so I find the people in between maybe not so much, but I'm really I've got a really optimistic view of the future with the under 30s being so ethically minded. They do the research and they say, no, I'm not going to go put my money into Australian super. I'm going to go into this smaller fund, etc. And I think that's growing.
Even younger, like school strikers, they inspire me so much. This new generation, like the first time I went to school strikers protest, there were like tens of thousands of them. And I cried. I was like, what have we done in school? I was having a crush on Backstreet Boys or something. And these kids are out there protesting and calling on the government to do better, calling on these companies to do better. It's really incredible to see the change, but I think we can't do it. One group or the other can't do it. Like it has to be a collective effort.
Yeah.
Anyway, all the best with your work, and thank you to John and to Munira for the work that you've done in preparing and presenting to us tonight. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
Really
Great.
Thanks for having us.